Alright guys, so like I said, I would finally get to this review, and it is finally about that time. After a total of 111 hours of completely finishing, 100%ing Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it is time to make a review. And so this is going to be split up into a bunch of different segments, and I'll attempt to put those all down in the description so you can kind of jump around as you please, because it's probably going to be a long one for a long game. But first, let me kind of explain what I mean by 100%ing the game. So, if you've played this game at all, you know there's a fish market and a hunter and all that stuff at your camp. I'm not talking about those types of things where you catch 4 fish just to do it. I'm talking I've done every quest, and if you open the map, every single marker on the map, even when you zoom in, the smaller markers, right? Because when you have it zoomed out, markers, and then as you zoom in, it brings you more markers that are more detailed locations. I've done all of those, completely every single marker on the map, except for one. And before we get into anything, let's talk about this one. So there are these stone stacking challenges within the game, and typically they're relatively easy, right? You start out on a flat surface. Most of the rocks are relatively flat. Maybe they'll have one that's not too flat and it's a bit challenging. You stack them up to the blue line and you complete them. This is just one of the side activities or mini games that they have throughout the map. But this one, in the last region, it is of course, the last thing I come to do, the thing stopping me from hitting 100%, keeping me at 99% done with the game. I spent around 3 hours stacking these damn rocks. And I watched so many videos, looked up stuff and walkthroughs and stuff. I cannot figure out these rocks. So technically, I did not 100% the game. I did not finish stacking these rocks. But just this one set of rocks. All the other ones, the other annoying things that you have to do throughout the open world, every other tiny little loot chest tucked away on the map I've found. It's just this one, and like I said, that takes around 111 hours. So, that does depend, of course, on your difficulty you're playing on and how stupid you are. If you're low down on the IQ scale like myself, then you're going to be up there over 100 hours. If you're pretty quick at figuring out these puzzles, you can probably cut a few hours off of that. But let's break down the video into how we're going to structure this so that you guys can jump as you please. Now, from this point on, there are going to be spoilers for the entire game and every Assassin's Creed game ever, I guess, because we're going to have to go back a little bit to other games to really understand what's going on here. So, there's your spoiler warning. Don't watch any further if you haven't finished the game. And so, the first thing we're going to concentrate on is the story and how it breaks down into 3 mini stories within the main story, and we'll get into that. That's going to be the first part of the video. Then we're going to move over to the gameplay and kind of the exploration and how all of that works. And then we'll end it off comparing it to Odyssey and Origins, the 2 other open world RPG games in the Assassin's Creed franchise. But before we start that list, 'cause that's a very long and detailed video on its own, let's talk about bugs and graphics really quickly. So everyone said this game had an immeasurable amount of bugs when the game launched, right? This and Watch Dogs came out relatively close to each other, and Watch Dogs was a relative mess, but again, nothing compared to Cold War, and people said that this game had a huge amount of bugs. Now, obviously, this is a month plus later, depending on when this video comes out, and so, honestly, even from the beginning to all the way up to now, I did not have that many bugs, right? I'll put a couple of them on screen now. The most annoying one that I had was 2 or 3, again, not really huge game-breaking bugs, but just annoying. The biggest ones that had a big impact were treasure maps, just not being able to be found, right? I'd find the map, and I'd go to the location, and, I'd even look it up, and it says, this is where it's supposed to be, right? I look it up on YouTube and forums and all that stuff. This is where the treasure is supposed to be, but it's just not there. That's one of the bugs that I had, and then I had that one about twice, I believe. And the other one, frequent one I had, probably happened about 5 times throughout my playthrough. I'd have this bug where you get on the horse, and the horse would just run in a straight line. You can't move the horse, you can't slow down the horse, it just keeps running. in a straight line. But then again, compared to a lot of the other things that have been launching recently, especially one particular game that will not be mentioned, I think that Assassin's Creed doesn't have that many problems. I mean, obviously it had a crash or two, and another big bug was one of these puzzles that we'll talk about later, where I just couldn't complete it for some reason. But again, out of my total of 111 hours playing through the entirety of the game, I had very few bugs. I mean, these are pretty much all of the major bugs that I came across. So from there, I'll talk about graphics before we get into story, because man, does this game look good. So if you watch my first impressions or any video I have with this game at all, I talk about how in the beginning of the game, when you're in Norway, the game looks very blue. Even during the day, it's very blue. And that is just an effect of the snow. While you're in England, the night does look blue-ish. It's not as bad as when you're in areas with snow. So again, I don't really have problems with the night as much as I did in my first impressions. Now, the day looks great. Alright? The daytime, the god rays, all that stuff, the water, all of that looks great. The hair and the beards and the faces, everything in this game looks amazing. Now, stuff like the grass and trees and some pop in whenever you're just in big open fields, all that stuff's not amazing, but I think the good just greatly outweighs the bad, right? I mean, the sunrise and set in this game looks great. Anytime you're near water, it looks great. I mean, I'm just gonna let some stuff play of just how good this game looks.
Curious. Oh, my game is not opening.
Hey guys, so this is a couple of weeks later. I have my hands on the Series X, so I just wanted to include this in the graphics section. This is partially why the review's been delayed, along with wanting to get my best and worst games of the year out. But again, this is on the Series X, running at 4K, 60 frames per second. As far as within Premiere Pro and you guys seeing it on YouTube, I don't know how much of a difference you're going to be able to tell, but there is a huge difference, right? Even within the menu, you can tell a difference, right? And you notice I'm on the Series X because I'm accidentally taking screenshots. And so just the 60 frames, everything, the animations run smoother, the weather runs smoother, just the dialogue when you're in cutscenes, everyone looks better, everything's just more crisp, the combat, and especially in a game like this where it's moment-to-moment combat. For example, if you play Jedi Fallen Order, most people would prefer to play that in the 60 frames mode with the lower resolution, just because in these types of games, especially on the higher difficulties, those 0.5 millisecond reaction times really decide if you win or lose the fight. And so just as far as a Series X version of the game goes, and again, I can't speak for the PC version, but while we're on graphics, I did want to just talk about how good this game looks on next gen. But now that we are through the bugs and graphics section, let's go ahead, get into that story. There's a lot here. I'll try to sum it up nicely into 3 separate little parts, but let's get straight into it. So what I'm going to do to have it make more sense for you guys is attempt to tell these in chronological order. And the starting point is going to make absolutely no sense until we get to the ending point, but I promise, at least to me, it'll make sense, alright? If you've played the game, it'll make sense. So at the very beginning, right, we start out chronologically with the first civilization, right? And this is only achieved through a series of side quest puzzles, if that's what you want to call them, and platforming puzzles. And once you do these, you kind of get the very first major plot point that really ties everything up in the end. So this is an important starting point. So the civilization collapses, and they make a pseudo-animus, I guess, if you want. And the people, some of the people at least that they show getting into this animus, Odin, Tyr, and eventually through his own ways, Loki. And so again, that all ties in at the end. I won't tell you the importance of it now, but just that's important. Remember that. Essentially what they do is they just upload their consciousness, I guess. That's how you want to look at it, into the animus, and we'll get more into that later. But let's start from the actual beginning of the game now. And so you play as young Eivor, either male or a female. I chose male. And so KLAN comes in, enrage you, your father dies, your mother dies, and your stepbrother, and you ride off. You get attacked by a wolf. They call you Wolf Kiss because you were attacked by a wolf. Alright, that is the beginning of the game in Norway. Now, proceed in Norway for the next couple of hours, and the only really important story stuff here is these two new assassin characters introduced, Basim and Hytham. Not Hytham from Assassin's Creed 3, new Hytham. It's only, 1,000 years off. And so essentially, if you've played Odyssey, they introduced this new order, exactly like the order from Assassin's Creed Odyssey, and it's just a list of bad guys that you end up having to kill. Later, that's a whole other storyline. So now we have two of the storylines introduced. So you go to kill the person that killed your family, well, father and mother, and from there you come back and you find out that your stepfather, Sigurd's father, is, dethroning himself essentially to another person in power in order to have an alliance between the two tribes, or whatever you want to call them. And so from there you guys decide that you're doing your own thing. You don't want to be followers essentially, and you're going to England to start your own settlement. That's the word I'm looking for. And so you go to England, you start your settlement, and you build it up. There's a couple of buildings there, just the essential ones, and you can build it up further, and we'll talk about that more later in the gameplay section. But from here, this is where we're introduced to the third storyline of making alliances across England. And so we'll cut back to the Horde map here in a second, but when you look at this map, there is essentially, I believe, 17 regions on the main map, and then 2 secondary regions, and then back in Norway there are another 2 regions. So it comes out to about 20-something regions that, for this conquering storyline, we'll call it, you have to play through all of them, and they're all very similar, but different enough to not be the same thing, and let me explain that more. So for a majority of the game until pretty much the end, the Sigurd storyline and the Order of the Ancient storyline kind of take a back seat, and I mean they're thrown in every now and then with a few regions, but this is the majority of the story, is going around from region to region making alliances. And I would say it's typically one of 3 scenarios. Either there's people fighting over who should be king, and you have to decide. That's one. The second type of region they have is that the king dies, and then you have to decide, who should take up the throne. And there's always person A who is, worthy of it, but doesn't have the skill set, and then person B who doesn't have the skill set and wants to, it's relatively the same in each region, but it's different enough to make it interesting. And so the third and final one is typically there's a order member here, which kind of interlaps with that other storyline, and you need to take them out and kill them and kind of save the region. So you go through region to region, and some are definitely a lot more interesting than others. There's some regions that are just plain and simple, go here, kill this guy, you freed the region, good job, right? It's just maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours per region. And so those are relatively basic and simple, but there's some, and I would say more than not, are really good. Like, they have you make meaningful choices, the characters are interesting, they show back up again multiple times throughout the story, and let's just go over a couple of them so that I can show you guys what I'm talking about. So I want to focus on, and again, spoilers here, 2 main regions. Again, pretty much every region you have to do, so it's not like any of them are optional or anything, it's just the outcome that is different. And I made a whole video on choice. It released the day Cyberpunk came out, I believe, so you can go watch that if you need a breakdown. I'll talk more about choice in maybe between the story and gameplay section, but essentially how this works is we'll talk about chronologically the first region you go to that has a big choice. I believe it's the second region in the widespread thing of the game, And so you go, and Soma, the leader of this area, you have to take back her little town with her, and then she finds out that there is a traitor, right? And so you go and you try to figure out who the traitor is, and you do missions for him and get to know him and kind of discover around the area. And each person has, unique and different reasons why they like Soma, why they don't like Soma, and they really do a good job of, making it somewhat realistic, where it's not just, it's very clearly this person. It could be this person, it could be this person, and the person who actually ends up framing this other person actually got me to believe that, their plan worked. I believed their framing of, oh, well, he stole the paint from this guy who had access to the paint, right, who committed the crime and was left at the scene. And so, it's not this meaningless, empty choice where it's obviously this guy actually got it wrong, chose the wrong person, and it gets even more interesting, in my opinion, from there, right? So if you choose the wrong person, when you go to do the final mission for this region, and every region pretty much ends in a siege of a castle or a monastery of some sort, so you go to do the final raid, and so at your forward operating base, essentially, is Soma and the 3 people, her council people that you believe to be traitors. Well, technically 2, because she kills the one, whichever one you pick, who you think the traitor is. And so you go off and do the mission, normal. But if you did not pick the right traitor, right, the actual person who betrayed her kills everyone at the forward operating base and holds the other surviving council person captive, right? But if you do choose the right traitor, when you first make the choice, right, everyone survives, it's a happy ending. But if you're like me and you made the wrong choice, killed the innocent person, they kill everyone at the base. And so really what affects, right, what you're asking essentially, what does this matter? Well, in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make too big of a difference, but this is one of those smaller choices just for immersion's sake. And so really what it does is, if you would have made the right choice, one of the council people come back to your clan and raid with you and live with you throughout the rest of the game. But if you're like me and you made the wrong choice, they choose not to do that. Soma is still your ally, and pretty much throughout the entire game, I don't think you can not earn an ally in a region. It's just different consequences around that ally. But if you've been paying attention to the gameplay in the background, this is probably my favorite region in the game, just because it is the most interesting and just dynamic with choices. And so let's break down what's been going on if you haven't been paying attention. Essentially, there is conflict within this region, right? They cannot come to a peace, and so you're tasked with giving the money to somebody who you think will help keep the peace. Again, you can talk to every single person, decide on whoever you give it to, and each person has a relatively different outcome, although it all ends in the same. And so obviously, I choose the wrong choice, and a good old crazy friend over here decides to slit this dude's throat and ends up killing him, starting a massive war. And so that's pretty much the worst possible outcome you could have got. And so somehow, though, before going to totally obliterate each other, you come to a peace, right? The woman I end up giving the money to says that it helped them, come to terms with it and negotiate the peace better. And so my choice there kind of had an effect on the story. Again, I still think it would have came to the same outcome regardless, just because of the huge story change that comes here in a minute. But it's just a nice little touch that they carry over. And so from there, right, your friend over here, and I'm not trying to throw names around just because I don't want to spoil what I don't have to, he isn't a fan of the people that you're making peace with, so he kills a certain character and frames it on the other people that you just made peace with. So then you go and kill all of the people that you just made peace with because you think that they killed X character, and then you find out that the person who killed character X did it himself, which I kind of predicted, and then you kill them. Alright? Again, I know that was very vague, but I'm trying not to spoil what I don't have to. Alright, and that's just 2 of the regions. There's, again, a lot of them are very similar to this, and a lot of them do have really good and interesting choices. But there are, maybe out of the 20 3 to 5 that are just rather boring, right? And they're an hour and a half to 2 hours, and if they're these really interesting, dynamic ones, that feels like a snap, right? It's real quick. You wish there was more. But for the more boring ones, these can kind of drag on, right? And again, I won't go into any more spoilers than I need to, but just need to know that for the Conquering or Alliance storyline, there's some boring and interesting ones. And essentially, this storyline will take you all the way to the end of the game, but about halfway through, you hit a halfway point, we'll call it, where they reintroduce the Sigurd storyline. And so this is essentially where all three storylines merge, right? You continue to gain alliances throughout the rest of the story, but Sigurd gets taken captive, and so that story kind of picks up, and you go throughout the world from region to region trying to get Sigurd back. But it also injects into the mess the Order of the Ancient storyline, in that you start more heavily focusing on taking them out, because the people who take Sigurd end up being part of the Order, as well as having more interaction with Bassam, because he really is interested in Sigurd and is helping you kind of look throughout the world to try to locate him and get him back. And so everything seems relatively simple so far, alright? Well, now this is where things start to get complicated, alright? So eventually, after doing a couple more regions, you get Sigurd back, but he's talking crazy, right? The people who kidnap him and Bassam have been kind of going on about this here and there throughout the story, but now Sigurd, one of the primary characters, I would say, is now spewing this nonsense about being a god, and so eventually, like I said, you do get him back, and everything seems to be okay, but he's just completely changed. He believes he's some sort of god and freaking sent, some kind of sent hero in order to follow these visions that he has to, bring everyone to Valhalla, right? And so this is where we have to go over probably my favorite part of the game, and that's the more mystical elements of Assassin's Creed. And so if you look at something like Odyssey, what it does is it kind of spreads out its mythical elements throughout the game, right? You have Medusa in this corner of the map, and you have the thing with the talking head in this corner of the map, and there's a serpent towards the end, and there's a Cyclops relatively in an easy starting area. But in Valhalla, it's all condensed into 2 story regions, right? And again, these aren't even primary story missions, right? You can continue to take alliances and take new regions across the entire map. You don't even have to come to this until the very end of the game. But I decided to do it halfway through, so that's where we're going to talk about it before we get to the end, because it is very important to the end of the game. And so, of course, what I'm talking about here is, if you've played the game, you go to Asgard and Jotunheim, and that's kind of the frost giant world. If you've seen any Thor movie, you know what I'm talking about. And so essentially how this works is it's through a potion, I guess that's what you want to call it, and you see through the eyes of Odin, right? They call him Havi, that's just another name for Odin, and you see through the eyes of Odin, and there's this long thing about Odin's storyline, and what's interesting, right, is the game plays it off very well. What I mean by that is it's not just this empty foreshadowing that you really have no clue what it means or why they're telling you this. Essentially, there's another story going on within it that is kind of your primary focus, but if you pay attention to the details, you can kind of work the ending out before you get there. And so this primary reason Eivor goes to these visions, I guess, if that's what you want to call them, is he has a prophecy, which I believe I spoke about in the beginning, at least I hope I did, because it's a big part of the story. And so his prophecy is that he is going to betray his brother. And so he sees through the eyes of Odin, and, it's a long, probably, again, I 100%ed everything, so doing all of the things in these new regions was much longer for me, but it's probably a 5-hour story arc between the 2 regions, that's I'm estimating. And so essentially what you see is Odin betrays Tyr, and again why that's important. later. So essentially the whole reason any of this goes down is because Loki, who is just Loki, has a son with one of the Jotunheim, and it's this big ass wolf that's supposed to bring Ragnarok. Alright? So obviously Odin doesn't like this. He's scared he's gonna die in Ragnarok, and he wants to stop it, so he wants to kill this wolf. But Odin made a promise to Loki that he wouldn't harm Loki or his son at all, so he can't attack this wolf. And Odin feels kind of betrayed because Tyr has known about, Loki's son being this wolf this entire time, and it was foretold that the wolf was going to bring down Ragnarok. So they decide to, tie the wolf up so that it doesn't bring about Ragnarok. Anyways, the only important stuff you really need to know from here is that there's a betrayal between Tyr and Odin, right? Loki has a son that is lost, I guess, if those are the direct words you want to use. Tyr loses his arm, and Odin loses his eye. Like I said, that'll all be important later. They don't tell you that, right? As far as the player knows while playing, this is for Eivor to see into the eyes of Odin to see how he handled a vision or prophecy he was foretold to die or betray someone in. And so that's kind of how it's handled until you get to the end of the game. So essentially you run around England making alliances and doing all of this stuff, killing Order members, until you get to the end. And so Sigurd decides that it's his time for his destiny and takes you back to Norway to kind of wrap everything up and fulfill his prophecy. Alright, so this is the end of Sigurd's storyline, the main storyline. The other two get resolved in the epilogue. But since this is the end of the game, things start to get confusing here. So we're going to slow down a lot and kind of explain this, because I've seen a lot of videos, a lot of people talking about the ending of the game that just clearly missed a lot. Alright, so you go down into this temple, and it ends up being a sort of animus for the first civilization that we talked about earlier. And Sigurd and Eivor go into this false Valhalla, essentially. It's a simulation of Valhalla. All their friends are there. It's endless battle. And Eivor is eventually like, oh, well, I don't want this. This isn't the real thing. This is just a simulation of Valhalla. And he, so the whole thing, nothing that hasn't been done before. But something that has been going on for the whole game is whenever you kill a Order member as Eivor, he has these visions or talks with Odin, and Odin is always playing devil's advocate to Eivor. And so when you try to leave Valhalla, right, or at least this simulated Valhalla, and so within this simulated Valhalla, it's just like Valhalla, or the way they explain it at least, it's endless battle. You fight over and over again. You're immortal. You live forever. You can have whatever you want. And so the reason this is really important is this is where it ties everything together. And if you weren't paying attention to the Asgard section of the game, you're really gonna miss out on what they're hinting to here, right? Because they don't just flat out tell you. So let me try to explain it in a way where everyone will understand it. So while within this simulated Valhalla, this animus, every time you battle, every day, you play through multiple days here, just this quick battle, and then you relive the same day. But every single time, Sigurd loses his arm, right? And that's something that happened earlier in the story, right? And if you were paying attention to the storyline in Asgard, when Tyr confronts the wolf, Loki's son, he also loses his arm, right? And Sigurd is fated to lose his arm over and over and over again. That's kind of where I started to, get the hint of, okay, so Sigurd might be a reincarnated Tyr, because again, you saw at the beginning of this video in that cutscene that I showed where they all go into that animus and kind of upload their consciousness. You see here, Sigurd loses his arm. Over and over and over, Tyr loses his arm. Right, so again, this is where I was kind of hinted to it. But then, in another one of these simulated Valhalla battles, right, Eivor is hit in the eye with an arrow. And who else in the Asgard section of the game loses an eye? Odin. And so you kind of see I was putting everything together. I was pretty confident that Tyr was some way related to Sigurd, and Odin was related to Eivor. And so, as you try to leave this simulated Valhalla because you want to go back to your friends and your family and everybody, Odin tries to stop you. And Odin's kind of been there the whole game, playing devil's advocate to Eivor. And so again, Odin doesn't want you to leave this simulated Valhalla. And so, they don't tell you this again, it's a lot of just speculation, but on my part, I think this is kind of, reincarnated Odin versus Eivor, the two different people internally fighting within Eivor's mind, right? The reincarnation of Odin wants to stay in the simulated Valhalla and be a god and fight day in and day out over and over and over, and Eivor just wants to return to his friends and his family and live out his time in England. And so this is kind of where they separate, right? But keep in mind that Eivor is Odin reincarnated, Tyr is Sigurd, or Sigurd is Tyr reincarnated, and so there's one more big twist when you come out of this animus. So Basim is there, and so let's talk about Basim, right? The whole game, he's kind of hinting that Sigurd is more than a person, the same way some of the people that take him captive is. And so, about halfway through, again, depending on what order you do the regions in, you get a kind of story moment with Basim talking about how he lost his son and his family and everything, and all he has left is the Hidden One's order, the assassins. And so when you get out of the animus, he's there holding Sigurd, about to kill him, and you engage in this huge fight, right? And so let me explain the foreshadowing over the whole game, how this really works. So within the Asgard storyline, right, Loki's son is the wolf, right? Odin takes the wolf away because he's scared of Ragnarok and the wolf destroying everything. So that's the connection between Odin and Loki, right? Now, Loki and Tyr kind of secretly keeps Loki's son hidden away and safe, and just make sure, he doesn't get out and destroy Asgard, but also protects him and, kind of keeps it a secret from Odin. And so about halfway through this game, Basim and Sigurd, if you haven't figured this out yet, we'll get there, they kind of have a secret that they don't tell Eivor. They're trying to find somebody for some reason, and they're working together. Eivor doesn't really agree with either of them, so they're kind of, again, working in secret, keeping it from Eivor. And so, again, when you see these things individually, they don't hint to anything, they don't stack up, nothing, right? But when you get to the end of the game, and in this final fight, Basim is talking about his son and how you took his son from him and all this and all of that. Plus, the simulated Valhalla showed to us that Eivor is a reincarnation of Odin and Sigurd is a reincarnation of Tyr. So who is Basim? Why is he mad at you about your son? Basim is Loki, reincarnated. Okay? And I'll run it through one more time in case it didn't make sense to you. So, Odin, he takes the wolf, locks it up. Tyr was working with Loki, and the wolf is Loki's son. Tyr was working with Loki to kind of hide the wolf from Odin and protect it. So within the Asgardian storyline, Tyr and Loki have a secret that they're keeping from Odin, and that kind of turns them against each other, right? And again, within the real world, Basim and Sigurd have a secret that they're trying to find this person for unknown reasons that they won't explain to Eivor, right? And as Eivor, you can react differently to it, which kind of leads the foreshadowing differently depending on how you react to their secret. You can, join them or be against it. I chose to just follow with them blindly. And so, really, the whole game tells you the ending. And this is really, right, if you haven't followed this, then maybe you won't enjoy it as much as I did. But just this foreshadowing of these characters have been explained to you since maybe, especially for me, since I did everything 50 plus hours ago. They outlined everything for you, and you just didn't know the details you needed. Let's finish out Sigurd's storyline, because we still have 2 other storylines to go over, and we're already 33 minutes in. Alright, so Sigurd and Eivor defeat Basim, putting him into the false animus. So you sit down with Sigurd and have a talk, right? And Sigurd goes over all the choices you've made, whether you sided with him or worked against him, and essentially, whenever you interact with Sigurd within the main story, because he's in essentially the first 25%, a little bit in the middle, and then in the end. And when you interact with him, right, there's essentially 3 dialogue options every time. There's yes, I agree, no, I don't agree, or I don't agree, but I'll help you, right? And that's kind of what I chose every time. I didn't agree with what he was doing, but he was kind of the leader of our clan, so I was doing what he said. And so based on what choices you made throughout the story, interacting with Sigurd, you either get the good or the bad ending. And this is that Sigurd either makes you leader of your clan and returns with you to England and you rule your clan together, or Sigurd chooses to not return with you and you just go back on your own. So those are the 2 kind of big main story endings to the game, and there's an epilogue for the other 2 storylines, but I'll go ahead and just let the ending play out because I like the cutscene.
Eivor's returned! Inside of the hearth, come!
Your secret is no longer safe.
Eivor? Eivor? Randvi? What is this? Is everything all right?
Our Jarl has returned to lead us forward into an uncertain future. Will you speak to your people?
For love and joy, words can jade. Our souls must sound in a heartful song. And when... You're less mine than I'm yours. And I ask of you only this. Keep me honest in the times to come.
Hearken well in Hall of Kings. On ocean steed my words gain wings. Odin's mead I forth will bring. For noble deeds thine honor sing. We beat and blaze our trail of red. In Odin gaze upon the dead. The voice resounds the mighty hall. For those who fight, for those who fall. For those who fight and those who fall. May horns resound the mighty hall. For we who fight, for we who fall.
So now, after finishing Sigurd's storyline, and that's technically the main storyline, we move on to kind of the alliance map conquering storyline, what I called it earlier, right? And so essentially you're having one final battle against King Alfred to take over England, and it's all of your allies, and the choices here that you made aren't as significant in the Sigurd storyline. It's just what people show up to aid you in the final battle, right? It's if you kept this person alive in this region, this person comes to help. If you kept this different person alive, this person come to help. If you were nice to these people, they would help you. If you weren't nice, they wouldn't help you. And so it just depends on who shows up to the final battle with you. And so you have this big final battle, a decent amount of them, and I would say, in my opinion, the more important ones die in this final battle. But you do end up winning over England entirely. So this ends kind of the alliance map storyline, right? Again, a large chunk of this storyline is just the stories within the regions, going from region to region, and kind of meeting the different kings and rulers and how they all interact with your clan. And so now we have completed the Sigurd storyline, we have completed the alliance map storyline. All we have left is the Order of the Ancient storyline, right? And so you get a letter telling you to come meet somebody to figure out and it turns out being King Alfred. Now, let's talk about the Order of the Ancient storyline and my problem with it. One, this is super predictable, right? Oh, it's the big bad guy is the big bad guy, right? That's not really, it wasn't a twist. I kind of saw it coming, and they kind of tried to play it off like, oh, well, he didn't want to do it, but he was kind of given the role, and he had to play along. But again, I didn't think it was super interesting. But more importantly, if you pull up the Order of the Ancients menu, I guess that's what you want to call it, the tree with all of the members on it, they silhouette the members that you haven't discovered, but they don't silhouette them well, because you can clearly tell who everybody is. Let me show you. And so you get hints as to the location of other members of people in the order. You have to go hunt them down and everything, but then again, like I said, none of them are really surprises, because you can clearly tell if you've ever met them before in the game, and looking at this menu, it's very obvious who they are. So that storyline kind of was the weakest for me, but overall, I really liked the other two. So now, I try to do this in an order that made sense, and not in order that it happened. We have to do the epilogue of the epilogue, is what I'm calling it. So, they hint to Assassin's Creed 3, and Connor throughout this game. They have the cave that he went into here, that's what I'm showing you now. But with Assassin's Creed 3, if you don't know who Desmond is, go look it up. I can't do a whole video on Desmond. And so, when you go inside the Animus as Layla, which is the present day protagonist you play as in these more recent games, you go into the Animus that Eivor and Sigurd go into, not the normal Animus. You meet this person who's going through all these different timelines, trying to stop the end of the world. It's called the Reader. That's Desmond. Alright, so he's just inside this Animus trying to look at all the different timelines and manipulate things to stop the world from ending again. Right? So that kind of leads off to another game and setting up another Assassin's Creed game. But more importantly, Basim is inside of this Animus, because that's how Sigurd and Eivor defeated him. And he's been inside this Animus for whatever the math is on that, from the 8th century to 2020. And so he's inside of this Animus, and you end up letting him out. And Layla brings the spear from Assassin's Creed Odyssey with her that kind of protects her and heals her, and this ends up healing Basim from being, again, however old he is, 1700 years old, 1800 years old, to being perfectly good again and just being good old Basim. And so Layla stays inside the false Ancient One's Animus, I guess, to help Desmond sift through the storylines or the timelines to try to find the way the world doesn't end, and Basim returns back with the other side characters in the present. And so Basim is in 2020 now. So Loki is in 2020 now. So I don't really know what they're going to do with this. I don't know why they needed to include this here. I think maybe they could have included it at the beginning of the next game. They don't really do anything with it. He's just there. Now, if they're hinting to a present-day Assassin's Creed, where you have to fight Loki, Basim guy, that would be cool. I'd be all down for that. But I don't know what they're doing with that, but just know Basim is in 2020. Alright? That's what you need to know. And so that's the end of the story section. If you've played the game, I know I skipped over like the entire middle of the game, but really all the super important things were just the Asgard section, the beginning and the end. So that's kind of what I wanted to focus on, because I think a lot of people just missed out on all that God stuff and reincarnation at the end, and I wanted to make that clear. Now, we are at the 43-minute mark almost, and we're moving to gameplay. And so starting off with gameplay, instead of focusing on kind of the central gameplay loop and how all of that works, I think with an RPG game, especially like this, and how they do it a little bit differently than everything else, it's important to focus on kind of the gear and loot first. So if you look at something like Odyssey, the last entry in the series, or even Destiny or Cyberpunk if you want something a bit more recent, but what all these games have in common is they kind of go for, at least in the loot department, the look there's loot approach. Right? What that means is there's just loot everywhere. You're constantly given loot, you're given, repetition of the same type of loot, maybe different variants or different, skill upgrades and stuff like that. But there's a lot of loot that you are constantly given. You have to sell it and manage your inventory and all that stuff. Valhalla doesn't do that. Valhalla instead chooses to give you very few pieces relatively compared to these other games. Very few pieces of loot, and give you the option to really go down a path with each one of them, right? There's probably about 10 armor sets, and you can mix and match, so I mean technically there's many more options than that, but complete armor sets there's probably about 10 with about 50 weapons overall. You can have hammers, flails, axes, swords, big heavy swords, short, small daggers, shields. There's a few handful of different weapons, and each with different styles and rarities and all that. And then there's legendary weapons, which there's Thor's hammer and why am I blanking on the name of the sword? Excalibur. And so the problem with Thor's hammer I have is you just don't get it till the end of the game. So if you're someone like me who 100%s everything, you have nobody to use this on, but that's just a small problem that I have. You're most likely not going to have that. But with such low amounts of loot in the game, this allows you, theoretically, through upgrading, you can end the game with the same weapons you start the game with. And so if you really like a weapon, you can hold on to it the whole time. If you want to change it up, because there is so much to do here, you can definitely change it up. And something that I think this allows that a lot of other games don't is if you look at something like Destiny or Cyberpunk, right, you're given all of these weapons and you're crafting resources, I guess. You have to really focus on, okay, well, I like this weapon, this is a good weapon, this is what I'm going to want to spend them on, because once you use them, you're most likely going to be out and going to have to collect them all over again, just because of the amount of loot you're given and the amount of times you're going to be upgrading a weapon. Inside Valhalla, right, there's still a lot of resources that you can collect, like in these other games, where you can just have an abundance of thousands and thousands of crafting resources. But because there is no system in place that, I guess if you want to say, encumbers you with loot, right, you have the option to fully upgrade every single piece of gear you have. Or if you're like me and you're looking for specific things, you just like axes, hammers, and swords, you'll have plenty of resources to upgrade the axes, hammers, and swords you find. You won't have to worry about, going and collecting more and choosing which pieces you want to upgrade. You can fully upgrade and experiment every weapon. And I know a lot of people don't like that, but personally that's just one of the things that I like a lot. And sticking on the topic of things people don't like about the combat, let's move on to just the combat in general. And Valhalla in general adopts a very Odyssey style of combat. It has your ability trees, I guess that you want to call them, on the side of your screen. You can use different and unique abilities that you get as you play further, and we'll get into that in a minute. You fight a combination of beasts and people and monsters, but overall, the main problem a lot of people have with the combat is because of, in my opinion, I think it's to further show off the gore system they have going on here. The combat isn't as flashy, right? In Odyssey, there's takedowns where you hit a guy 15 plus times, and super fast, super flashy, but there's no gore, there's no brutality to it, it's just showing off, right? It's the same thing with a lot of the abilities. They're, Spartan kicks and just crazy things like that in Odyssey. In Valhalla, the abilities are, well, there are crazy ones, don't get me wrong. They're a lot more practical and useful against different enemy types. Now, personally, I like this combat a bit more. I feel like the way you earn abilities is more refined in this game and kind of fits the way I play the game. I'm sure a lot of people who played the game didn't get all of the abilities just because, where in Odyssey, you were kind of handed the abilities through a skill tree type system, and as you played, you just gradually unlocked more and more abilities. In Valhalla, you have to explore to get the abilities, right? You have to find books of knowledge throughout the world. So if you're not somebody who likes to explore, if you're just going to run through main story, now granted, a lot of these are within the main story areas, so, there are abilities that are practically necessary to complete some parts of the game, but some of the more unique abilities are tucked away in the corners of the map, which I like because that causes and kind of forces the player to explore if they want to get and unlock all of the cool and unique stuff. And so from there, let's talk about exploring in the world and just kind of how all of that works. So within the story section, I spoke about the regions of the game and how all of that works. And so gameplay-wise, again, if you are 100%ing everything like I did, if you're just doing story stuff, this won't so much apply to you. But there is side content within every region, right? It can be rap battles, dice games, drinking contests, actual quests where you have to do things to help people. It can be pretty much anything, right? Stacking stones that you'll spend hours on and never finish and shoot yourself in the head. It can be anything, right? And here's where, as a completionist, I have a problem with the game. One of my problems that kind of lowers the game for me is that they do the thing that a couple of other games do. This isn't unique to Valhalla in any way, but if you want to go to place A, let's say, right, you go there, you get the loot, you can open the map or use your Raven in order to see where the loot is and, get what you want. And again, if you're a completionist, you want to get everything before you go on to do other things. And so the game kind of tells you without telling you that, hey, you can't do this, right? If you try to go into an area, there'll sometimes be pieces of loot that you just can't get. Right, you can't figure out how to get to. You watch tutorials online how to get this one stupid chest that you know is going to have nothing in it, but you just want it just to get the notification off of your map. At least that's how I feel when I play games like this. And they don't tell you, you just have to realize this on your own, that you can't get this right now. You have to come back later in the story. You'll unlock these doors or this hidden area, and it'll be open later for you to come back to. And in the beginning, not knowing this really annoyed me, as I would spend hours trying to figure out how to get to certain chests. I mean, the way I approach things like this is go to a region, you work counterclockwise or clockwise, however you want to do it, and just do everything. Once you've completed everything, all the chests, all the side missions, all the world exploration points, the synchronization points, once you've completed everything in a region, then you work on the main story. That's how I play games like this. And again, if you're not someone who likes to do every single thing on the map, this isn't going to affect you at all. But it's just something that in the beginning I wish I knew and would have saved me at least a couple of hours. And so, while I'm kind of talking trash on the exploration, I like it a lot. Other than navigating the city areas and trying to 100% those are an absolute mess, because you can't tell if something's above you or below you. Those are very annoying to navigate as someone who's trying to 100% them when you're not supposed to be 100%ing those areas yet. But just there's a good mix is how I feel about exploration, right? There's a good amount of combat challenges, there's some fun things like the rap battles, there's the dice game, and it's time for a rant on the dice game. This, other than Gwent, is the best card dice side mini-game I've played in any game ever. This is my favorite part of the game, and I'm not joking. It's so good. And again, this is where I might lose a lot of you, but if you're 100% in the game, this is one of the things you're going to have to do, along with the rap battles and the drinking contests and all that stuff. Well, the drinking contests are my least favorite thing and are relatively boring and just easy. The dice game, or log I believe it's called, it's interesting, and what I realized about halfway through doing them, because there's a lot of these around the map, is that they have kind of a smart AI in place, and it's not technically smart, but the way it works is each person you go to play against in a new area plays differently, right? This person might be super defensive, this person might be super offensive, this person might try to steal your god chips, which are those little tokens right there that you spend on special abilities. This person might use a lot of god chips so that they kill you quickly, stuff like that. Every single one of them plays a bit differently, which forces you to play a bit differently. Now, I'm not saying it's flawless, right? There's definitely strategies that are completely broken, but it's a lot of fun. It forces you to kind of just take yourself out of it and just enjoy playing a game of dice. And honestly, if this was a individual game, they had a spin-off game like Gwent of this, I would play the hell out of this. I would probably buy it for real money. Alright, it's that much fun. But let's talk about the majority of the combat, what most players are going to be doing. Again, a completionist will get to this part of the game eventually after many, many hours of knowing what we're doing, and ignore me messing around in photo mode. But like I said in the story section, that making allies and alliances, territory alliance map part of the story is the main bulk of the game. And so this gameplay usually has a fairly similar loop, and like I said, the story and kind of the situation around what's happening is relatively what changes, but the gameplay is practically the same. You go to a region, some things happened, someone needs your help, you do some mission where you go find some intel or go kill a specific target or something, which results in more people getting angry at either you or the person you're helping, and so it results in this big fight where you storm a castle and you kill everybody. Alright, and I thought relatively early on that this is going to get really repetitive really fast, and for some people it might. But the first half of it, where you're in these towns, all the towns are so unique and interesting. Like I said in the story section, there are some rather boring areas, but the gameplay within them, even though you're doing practically the same thing over and over again, the story that comes along with it is interesting enough to keep the gameplay engaging. But these tower sieges never got boring, right? Like I said earlier, this is 20-something regions, so you probably do this 18, 19-ish times. It's fun every time. Go through and just absolutely slaughter everybody, right? And some forts are harder than others, right? There's walls in some of them, the freaking molten oil cauldrons in some of them, ballistas, you have to use the rams from time to time. There's bosses, some of them you can do stealthily, and these are just fun every time. I don't have a problem with any of these. And so that's kind of where just the gameplay lies. As far as what you'll be doing within the story, it's a lot of intel gathering when you first enter a region, and then talking and making alliances, making decisions, and then from there you go and fight in a big castle. Now, as for the side content gameplay we went over, the exploration type stuff, it's a lot of just rap battles, dice games, all of that stuff. But I think there's a good mix of it to keep it interesting and engaging, even when you're doing everything in the game. None of this stuff over my 111 hours got boring or dull. And I mean, there are frustrating parts, and if you're just an idiot like me and can't figure some things out, it can get annoying. But that's not the game's fault, that's more my fault. And so while we're here on the topic of combat and gear and all of that stuff and gameplay just in general, I want to talk about the enemy structure and the enemy types. And so there's none that are really surprising in this game, I guess you could say, right? You have your typical enemy types, your archers, your heavy archers, I guess that's what you want to call them, regular foot soldiers. There's all different types of heavies with unblockable attacks and ranged attacks and unblockable blocks and all types of stuff. But something that I feel is interesting personally in this is that the difficulty level, I guess that's what you want to call it, comes in with beasts more than people. And so what the fuck does that mean? So essentially, when you get further and further, even if you just play main story, this is a relatively long 40 to 50 hour story, right? You're going to memorize and parry and Batman Arkham Knight style of absolutely smack every single person you come across. You're just going to remember exactly how they fight. Each individual enemy type, well, they have a different routines that they go through. They relatively have the same 5 or 6 attacks or blocks that they do, and they can be relatively defeated easily, especially if you've done everything and you're super overpowered like I am in these types of games. So just really quickly comparing this to Odyssey, what I want to focus on is kind of the way beasts and mythicality and all of that is just explored in both of these games. And I believe I kind of talked about this in the story section. And so essentially in Odyssey, if you haven't played that, there's a large focus on Medusa and Cyclops and griffins and serpents and all these giant mythical beasts, right? And while they do have animals within the game, it's mostly just these monsters. And while we're on the topic, the way it's presented in Odyssey is also drastically different than in Valhalla, right? Odyssey stretches it out throughout the entire game. You know, this region has a Medusa, this region has a Cyclops, there's another Cyclops up here, you know, griffins over here, serpents, you know, down here. It's spread out very drastically across the entire game. While they do have a bit of that within Valhalla, the main kind of mythicality, again, Asgard, like I talked about in the story section, that's all within one contained segment. And so a lot of your crazy style gameplay, because that's what I call it, unique style of gameplay, is all going to come in one specific area. And so going back to difficulty and fighting people and beasts, the beasts are a lot harder to fight, even when you're overpowered, just because their movement and attack patterns and all that stuff is erratic, right? You haven't fought these guys 100,000 different times, and I'm not saying that you can't figure out how they attack and how they play during the fight, because you definitely can, but you're not going into it with a preconceived notion of, okay, they're going to do A and B, and then I have to hit them like C. It's just, God, I hope they don't want to hit me, and then figure it out from there, right? And I think those are a bit more unique, and that kind of shows the gaps in this game as far as gameplay goes, right? The human bosses are far and few between. I don't really remember more than 2 human bosses in this game, right? Now, again, I guess technically if you count Odin as a boss, which I talked about in the story, I guess you can count 3, but I remember very distinctly multiple boss battles within Odyssey, right? Human boss battles. And I'm not saying that I need those or beast battles or anything, just they're not very memorable, and maybe, again, that's because I was just super OP in this game, but I just don't really have anything crazy or anything nice to say about the human combat as far as boss battles go, right? The beast battles are, like I said, all good, all well balanced. The Asgard stuff's really well done. And so from there, there's one final gameplay mechanic that I want to focus on, just because technically you are forced to at least participate in it a bit. So I want to cover it for everybody, and those completionists, you will be engaging in this a lot. And so these are the raids, right? The way these are advertised in all the trailers and the gameplay previews and all that stuff, and the way they work aren't exactly as fulfilling for me as I would have liked them to be. And that just goes with the boat as well. We haven't talked much about your longship just because there isn't much there, right? There's customization here and there, and you can choose who you want on it and stuff like that. And it looks good and it's cool when you get to use it, but in no way is it efficient or practical to go anywhere by longboat, right? Some places force you to use it, and that's where it's cool and unique, but it's not as advertised where you're going across the entire countryside in your longboat. Within the first couple of hours, you get an upgrade for your horse to let it swim, and essentially from there, you can just take your horse everywhere. And so, grades are really used primarily to upgrade your camp, and you don't naturally stumble across them. You go seeking for them, and I think that's something that we kind of knew, right? Gameplay trailers always show things a bit differently than they actually are. And so there's essentially 2 ways to do these raids, right? There's the way most people probably do them, which will roll up on your boat, start a raid, slaughter everyone, get the loot, and leave. Or you can do it the significantly more efficient way and stealth kill everybody, right? And I know a lot of people, that's going to be a whole debate, right, with stealth, and do you do stealth in these games anymore? I still like stealth where it is available, but you stealth kill everybody, call your people in, and you just loot the chest and leave. The problem with that method is this is where kind of the bugs with the game start to show, right? When trying to open a chest or open a door during a raid, you have to wait for your allies, and if they're in combat or if they're just not right there waiting for you, they kind of struggle to get anywhere near you, or sometimes you have to, activate the animation multiple times to get a chest open, and just the raids are something that I felt got repetitive, right? Where the castle sieges and all that stuff was the same thing over and over again, but it was cool. I felt that the castle layouts were different enough, and each one of them with the story within the region was built up well. But the raids, there's no story behind them. You're just raiding random camps to get supplies back for your settlement, right? And we'll talk about the settlement here in a minute. But again, just the raids I felt personally could have been done a bit better. I would have liked to see more implementation with the longboat and kind of being not forced, but there being a reason to using it, because there's a lot of cool stuff. They have the chains that come up on some of the rivers blocking you from progressing, and they have an ambush. Sometimes little pallets pop up out of the water and they ambush you when you're going through a tight section. There's really cool and dynamic stuff there, but efficiency-wise, there was no reason for me to call my boat to cross this little stream, right? It's faster for me to just run on my horse or fast travel, right? And like I said, I just wish that they would have integrated the boat with the raid system a bit better. Maybe make these raid camps only accessible by water. That'll be forcing you to use the boat and having like these dynamic interactions with your boat and with your crew and all that stuff. That would have been cool, but that's just not here. But the final piece of gameplay that I want to talk about is how the raids and the camp and all of that stuff works. So when you raid a base and open these chests and get these loot, you're getting them to upgrade and better your settlement. And so there's two resources. Don't remember what they're called because it's been weeks since I've beaten the game at this point. And so these two resources you collect from doing raids, and you can get them from other unique chests across the game, but you primarily get the resources from doing raids, and you use these to upgrade kind of your base of operations. And so my problem here, while this is a cool idea that I definitely hope they expand upon in the future and implement in other Assassin's Creed games, my primary problem with it is that the first couple of upgrades, right, the people who just play through the story, those types of upgrades are cool, right, the early ones. Once you get through all of those, once you get through the fishing hut and the blacksmith, the dockmaster, the barracks, the tattoo shop, all the cool things, the merchant, all that cool type of stuff, you just get, wheat farm, chicken farm, bakery, stuff that increases this feast buff, which is essentially like eating in any RPG game, just gives you a huge buff, which you don't need in this game, right? I never used it once. And so, again, a lot of the later upgrades you're just doing to do them, and I guess that's with the 100% of everything that kind of just comes with it. But I felt that there could have been more meaningful upgrades to the camp and just made it better overall if there wouldn't have been so many of these just you're upgrading to upgrade it. And so we've talked about story, we've talked about gameplay, so let's just talk about overall and how this compares to the other Assassin's Creed games. And so first, I think you have to know my favorite Assassin's Creed games are pretty much Odyssey and Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, right? Those are neck and neck, right? And that was before I played this. And I like Odyssey. I won't go into it too much for very similar reasons to why I like this game, right? But Brotherhood is one of those just linear story games that, that was the style back then 10 years ago, and it does it really well. I mean, I'm sure now the controls specifically don't hold up, especially the graphics as well, but again, back then, the way the story was told, the twist was in it, some of the gameplay mechanics, recruiting different people for your Brotherhood and all that stuff, that was really cool. And so, where does Valhalla hold up? And so I thought about this a lot. This is another reason that this review is taking so long, is do I like this more than Odyssey? And I'm going to say yes, I like this more than Odyssey, and a lot of people aren't going to like that answer, because a lot of people really don't like this game. A lot of people like Odyssey a lot more. And I think what you have to do is sit down when you play this game and think, this isn't Odyssey, right? It's not that Greek time period that a lot more people know a lot better. There's not those flashy red and gold and blue and greens that were all over Odyssey. Valhalla is very brown and just fucking ugly, but I think that's kind of the point of the game, right? It's supposed to be more brutal and grounded. And I say grounded, but next, the god stuff, right? That's just your particular choice. If you like your stuff spread out throughout your entire game, Odyssey chooses to focus on that, right? It spreads out its mythicality plot lines, I guess, throughout the entire game. And while I'm not saying that it's not there, they're more just for fun, right? You're just fighting these big beasts for the fun of it. And there is a small story at the end of the game, but I feel personally the way Valhalla does it and has a super focused, detailed story section on the mythical parts, I find that a lot more compelling than the way Odyssey does things. While I can see, certain people's perspectives on how Odyssey has better gameplay, I don't really favor one over the other. They're both great for me. And something I noticed while comparing these two games is that the RPG Assassin's Creed games, Bayek in Origins, Cassandra or Alexios in Odyssey, these are a lot of names, and Eivor in Valhalla, all of their stories are very similar, right? And by similar, I mean they're all about family, right? Bayek's son is killed, Alexios or Cassandra's, depending on what you choose, father and or sibling is killed. In Valhalla, again, spoilers, there's a whole bunch of stuff. There's a lot of stuff going on here. I can't keep track of all these 3 games. And so I feel like Valhalla is the combination of both Origins and Odyssey. While Origins kind of put down the groundwork for everything and tested the waters, Odyssey really dove into it and kind of, put the foot down where this is an RPG game, this is what they're doing. And Valhalla just expands across that and refines it even more. And I just think the setting is what really, throws a lot of people off. If you, for example, switch to these 2 games, right? If you had Odyssey, the previous game, essentially, be the Viking setting, and now the next game, the sequel, this Valhalla, be the Greek one, I think people would like this one more. Just simply because it's more refined, right? Essentially, they took all the things from Origins to Odyssey. They took out things that didn't work, refined the things that didn't work, made them, expanded on them, right? Especially the RPG side mission points of it. Same thing with Odyssey to Valhalla. They expanded on it, refined it. And I think Valhalla is kind of that ultimate refinement where they can maybe do one more of these. And it would have to be a really good game, right? Like, it would have to be a 10 out of 10 in order for them to do one more of these. Otherwise, they need something. I think we're at the point with Assassin's Creed where they need to do a present day or somewhat present and the storyline they have going on. They cannot do this RPG thing for 3, 4, 5, 6 more games. If you look at old Assassin's Creed, right, I'm talking 1, 2, Brotherhood Revelations, 3, 4, right? Look at those games, Rogue, I guess, if you want to count that. Look at those games, and then people started to get tired of the same formula. They reinvented, right? Unity and Syndicate. There's only 2 of those. I feel like there's only 2 of those. Unity and Syndicate, right? People hated both of them pretty much. I don't have a problem with Unity. Hate Syndicate. But they reinvented again to this RPG style. Now I think, again, we have Origins, we have Odyssey, we have Valhalla. I think we can go one more, kind of do something really interesting, a really interesting setting, right? Odyssey kind of was that interesting setting to put the world in, show everyone that Assassin's Creed can do RPG style games, and then Valhalla, they focused more on the story and refining the gameplay and exploration and all that stuff. Now let's combine a really interesting setting with all of this new refinement that they found in Valhalla and make, the last 10 out of 10 RPG Assassin's Creed, and then we'll reinvent from there, right? Move on to something new. Again, this isn't because I don't like what they're doing. I really like this, but I feel like a lot of games are recently, within the past 4 years, are going down this RPG style. I mean, freaking Doom has like a home base with stuff. If you look at Call of Duty has side missions now with like puzzles to solve, and just a lot of games are choosing to kind of opt more and more and more. Avengers is an RPG game. Like, there's just a lot of RPG-ness going on right now, and I think we're going to get to a point within the next couple of years where, I mean, we're done, right? Like, we're just RPG'd out. Like, I mean, how it used to be, there were a couple of just, the Fallouts, all those types of games. The really strong RPGs that came out every couple of years. We're at the point now where just everything, if they can't figure out what they want to make it an RPG, because that's what's hot right now. And I think that's going to die out relatively soon. Within this console generation, that trend will die out. And I think Assassin's Creed needs to kind of get ahead of that and switch to something different. Maybe they go back to the linear story game they used to do. I'm not sure. I'm not saying I know where that direction is. I'm just saying they need to innovate and move forward. But we've talked for a while now. It's a long one. If you're still here, good job. Pat on the back. But Assassin's Creed Valhalla, 9 out of 10. Favorite Assassin's Creed game. Game of the year. Game of last year by the time you guys see this. And looking forward to the next one. See you guys on the next video.